Welcome, everyone. I'm hoping that, Dennis, you will facilitate the entire proceedings, but let me just go straight to it because it's time. Welcome, everyone, to this webinar. We are excited to have everyone join us so that we could share some of the exciting findings that have emerged out of the work that we are doing in the 17 countries across Africa, focusing on a 5-year project that we started in 2023 with the support of the Mastercard Foundation. We went out to forge a partnership with the foundation to look at the extent to which the nonprofit sector creates dignified and fulfilling jobs for young Africans between the ages of 18 and 35. And so we've been doing this work in Southern Africa, focusing on Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, DRC, and South Africa. In East Africa, focusing on Ethiopia, Rwanda, Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya. In West Africa, focusing on Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Burkina Faso, and Cote d'Ivoire, as well as in North Africa, focusing on Egypt and Morocco. And in all of those countries, we have partners that we've been working with us, mainly universities and research centers who have also gone as far as making sure that they work with young people on the ground, some of them who are students who are also part of this program. We also made sure that this is not just focusing on research, but we have other interventions that we've been focusing on in the project, one of which is training of doctoral students. We anticipated to have selected 20 students who are also focusing their studies on the same topic, but in those countries. And so far we have 19, hoping to add an additional 3 or 4 in the next year. We also are fascinated by looking at how to communicate at various stages of the project. And so there's a big communication angle to the work that we are doing. We also are fascinated by, making sure that we do an assessment and evaluation of the impact of the work that we're doing. And so there's a monitoring and evaluation angle to it. But of course, like in any other project, there's issues to do with coordination and governance of the project. And we do this jointly with the foundation, but we also make sure that we engage the different stakeholders. And so we do have a focus on young people themselves, and we have gone from country to country in terms of mobilizing young people to consulting about how they want to be engaged. And secondly, what are their definitions and experiences of the nonprofit sector when it comes to the provision of dignified and fulfilling jobs. We also have thought of including various sectors in the governance of the project. And so we do have a gender committee, we have a steering committee. We also meet quarterly with the foundation to just reflect on the outcomes and the experiences of the different partners on the ground. And so we are at a stage where we are ready to share some of the interim findings of the quantitative phase of the research. And I'm sure that colleagues will be drawing from some of that analysis, as well as drawing from the literature reviews that were conducted. And so this promises to be an exciting presentation of experiences of young people in the nonprofit sector in the area of job creation in the first set of countries that we are focusing on. And this is the first of the 4 webinar series that we're going to be hosting going forward. And so thank you, everyone. And I hand over back to Dennis so that he can facilitate the proceedings. Over to you, Dennis.
Thank you, Prof, for the good introduction and the welcome remarks. By way of going through the program, I don't know if my screen, you can see my screen. by way of going through the program. We have 4 presenters, and as Prof indicated, we have done some preliminary findings of our literature review, and today we want to share the findings with you and then engage with you on some of the issues that are coming out from the literature reviews. So I will, to start the ball rolling, I will invite our first presenter, Dr. Roland Banya, to do the presentation for Uganda. So he will start off with a quick introduction and then zoom into the presentation. Each presenter actually has about 15 minutes to do the presentation. And then thereafter, we'll have discussants, so we'll have all the presentations, and then the discussants will come in with some reflections on some of the policy implications that he sees in the report and general reflections on the report, and also some of the things that we can consider going forward in the qualitative phase of the project. So I'll hand over to Dr. Roland Banya. Dr. Roland Banya is the Research ICT Africa. Over to you, Dr. Roland.
Thank you, Dennis. Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Roland Banya. I'm a senior economist at Research ICT Africa. Pleasure to be here and pleasure to share these findings with you. Dennis, could you please stop sharing your screen, please, so I can share from my end? Thank you. I hope you can all see my screen.
Yes, I can see. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. So we're looking at the non-profit sector contribution to the creation of dignified and fulfilling work for young people in Uganda. And I'll give us, just a brief overview or context of Uganda. So Uganda is a landlocked East African country. It has one of the youngest populations in the world, with 75% under 30 and a 3.7% growth rate. Youth unemployment is a major challenge, with over 1 million youth entering the workforce annually. It's also important to note that the national definition of youth in Uganda is 12 to 30 years old. What's also critical to note is that Uganda's overall unemployment rose from 2.7% in 2013 to 6.5% in 2021. These are ILO statistics. And the youth unemployment rate is 17%, with young women facing higher unemployment than men. Rural unemployment also exceeds urban unemployment, with most employed youth working in agriculture as well as fishing. Youth unemployment is a complex issue, complex to the point that Uganda government has intervened severally through different initiatives. For instance, the Uganda government has a 5-year national strategy for employment in agriculture, which was launched in 2017, and has a 52.9 billion shilling budget to re-engage the youth in the agriculture value chain, as well as create jobs and establish an information hub. There is also the National Youth Livelihood Program, which is coordinated by the Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development, that provides vocational skills and startup capital in a revolving fund to combat youth poverty and unemployment. But in all of this, NGOs have emerged as a vital alternative for youth employment. The NGO sector in Uganda grew significantly after the 1970s and 80s. And what we saw in that period was government failure broadly in Uganda. And this push for NGOs was led by faith-based organizations initially, but later supported by international NGOs and donors. Uganda hosts several international, regional, and national NGOs. So NGOs have increasingly contributed to Uganda's development and job creation, especially for the youth. And this role is amplified through increased donor funding. One thing we found from the research we carried out is reliable data is lacking on the number, on the nature and quality of youth employment provided by this sector. So this literature review aimed to identify the data gaps concerning Uganda's non-profit role in youth and employment, but also highlight how various subsectors within the industry could be crucial in establishing respectable as well as long-term employment for the youth. So we see that in Uganda, NGOs are primarily regulated by the Non-Government Organizations Act of 2016, which mandates the NGO Bureau to register and maintain, as well as keep up to date a register on non-government organizations in the country. Other regulatory laws in Uganda include the NGO regulations of 2017, the fees regulations of 2017 as well. These are supported by the Companies Act of 2012, to mention but a few. Registration for NGOs offers benefits such as facilitating coordination, identifying service gaps, avoiding duplication, and bringing donor funding on budget. However, the regulations also grant the NGO Bureau broad powers to inspect, suspend activities without due process, which has also led to concerns from NGOs on the restriction of especially activist NGO activities. NGOs are registered under 5 broad categories in Uganda, which is indigenous, which is wholly Ugandan controlled. There is regional. These are incorporated in an East African country. Continental, those are incorporated in a non-East African country, but are partially or wholly African controlled. There is foreign, which is incorporated out of Africa, and then international, which is in a non-EAC country and a partially and wholly non-EAC citizen controlled. We also see that NGOs in Uganda operate in diverse sectors. So from health to education, agriculture, environment, humanitarian assistance, and post-conflict reconstructions. Some focus on macro policy issues, advocacy, accountability, and governance. These can be broadly divided into development-focused and advocacy/research-focused NGOs. Some NGOs are national in scope, as I mentioned. Others serve in one or few districts across the country, and some engage in multi-sectoral activities. So broadly, engaging in, for instance, health, education, community advocacy, to mention but a few. Most NGOs in Uganda are also small, dispersed. We find that most are urban-based and traditionally founded by elites with networks to pool funding. The sector is also characterized by independence. There's a vibrancy around it. There's flexibility, as well as ease of entry and exit, often restricted ownership, challenges around funding, operational scope, as well as some of the characteristics of the NGOs that we found through this literature review. So one thing that we also found is, Uganda has a huge challenge of unemployment, but then the economy should ideally create about 700,000 formal jobs annually. However, we find that it only creates about 75,000 jobs, which highlights a major employment shortage in the country, with the nonprofit sector emerging as a potential job creator. We also see NGOs significantly contributing to Uganda's social, economic, and political growth, particularly in the area of social development. Again, issues around education, health, and so on. The nonprofit sector can be an alternative to the state, promoting inclusive development through participatory, citizen-driven approach and acting really as an advocate for, the low-income Ugandans. A key contribution, particularly from development-focused NGOs, which is distinguished from advocacy-focused NGOs, is really job creation. We see that NGOs are vital service provider, social capital catalysts, and advocates for vulnerable groups. We also see that they create jobs directly and indirectly. and indirectly could be, for instance, through support for incubators. And while broad NGO data, job data is missing, a good proxy, if I may, that we found was social enterprises, so which are classified as non-profit. These show potential. A report on sub-Saharan Africa suggested social enterprises can address the job challenges and income inequality, often through employing people from underserved communities, including marginalized youth. The estimates in this report for direct jobs created by social enterprises range between 28 to 41 million across sub-Saharan Africa. In Uganda, an estimated 27,400 social enterprises employed over 65,000 people directly, with a projection of over 86,000 jobs by 2030. But again, this is a report from 2019. I'm sure there have been more recent studies on this space. So employment is hypothesized to align with GDP contributing sectors, which include manufacturing, services, agriculture. And in Uganda, although agriculture is the lowest GDP contributor, it employs the largest labor force, about 63% of Ugandans. This is followed by services at 29%. So we're seeing that most Ugandan youth enter the low productivity agriculture sector and often remain there. And this is also collaborated by a report by the World Bank. We also see that, large food manufacturing companies in the agro value chain offer better paying jobs than primary agricultural wage labor. The role NGOs can play is through promoting youth employment in higher productivity agricultural subsectors. For instance, as I mentioned, agro-processing, research, by supporting the acquisition of critical technical skills for, non-farm and urban enterprises. And lastly, on this slide, we see that, the non-profit sector advances inclusive development through addressing youth needs, especially those at the margins. And I'll speak to that in the subsequent slide. Across Africa, we're seeing many NGOs, supporting businesses at all stages, from ideation through to incubation and growth. And although directly employing few, NGOs could play a role in creating hundreds of jobs through self-employment and supporting self-employment, as well as new business startups. Some Ugandan initiatives we're seeing that are supported by NGOs in this particular regard include the Youth Entrepreneur Scheme, the Youth Venture Capital Fund, the Graduate Venture Fund, as well as the Youth Livelihood Program. I'll move on to the next slide. So, as I mentioned earlier, NGOs could play a role in improving youth unemployment, and one of the areas that we're seeing is the informal sector. So the informal sector is a vital livelihood source for marginalized groups like the less educated, the youth, and women. This sector includes everything from street vendors to established companies across trade, manufacturing, agriculture, and services. In Uganda, the informal economy contributes over 50% to Uganda's GDP and accounts for more than 80% of employment, with minimal gender variation. Rural informal employment is 90%, which is higher than urban at 81%. And youth struggle less with acquiring skills than finding suitable jobs that we have seen through this research. We see that 92.2% of young workers hold non-formal jobs, with non-formal jobs. So, in addition, we are seeing that informal sector is often predominantly female, and it's driven by lack of education and skills, limiting access to better paying jobs. We're seeing also that, there is, due to lack of rural jobs, we're seeing a lot of unemployed rural youth migrating to urban areas where the informal sector often serves as an inadequate sink for job seekers. So we're seeing most of these unemployed rural youth coming to towns and really engaging with this sector. Beyond lacking skills, young people face job search barriers, such as limited access to job postings, poor skill articulation to employers. And since we're seeing that the informal sector will remain a major employer in the short to medium term, improving workforce productivity, especially for these youth, is critical to addressing unemployment as well as underemployment in the sector. Enterprise development is one intervention, and we've seen informal workers citing the need, for support, whether it's through access to credit or technical skills. So yeah, broadly, we're seeing developing relevant skills and knowledge is also key to improving productivity, looking at working conditions, as well as broadly promoting decent work. We're also seeing issues such as technology or better technology, as well as reskilling and retooling, leading to higher incomes and more rewarding jobs among the youth. NGOs in Uganda are, playing this role of an enabler. They are providing training, capacity building, as well as microfinance to address some of these challenges. Some of these programs offer essential skills such as business management, financial literacy is a big one, access to market, and so on and so forth. So youth on the margins in Uganda are disadvantaged across multiple intersecting factors. So from gender, ethnicity, class, disability, refugee status, etc. So getting into formal employment is often unattainable for these youth at the margins. The vulnerability is compounded by a high rate of the working poor, as well as bad work, precarious work, they're underpaid, and often involved in exploitative labor. And nothing exemplifies a youth on the margins, such as the youth in northern Uganda. And these youth have been affected by decades of civil war, poverty, and lack of livelihood opportunities. The situation in northern Uganda is quite acute. Consequently, many of these youth are trapped in, precarious informal work, as I've mentioned. To overcome these barriers, we're seeing that the majority of these marginalized youth turn to self-employment in the informal sector, combining paid and unpaid and self-employment work, which often fails to improve their circumstances. We also see here that a lack of credit for this self-employment intervention is a major obstacle. Again, nonprofit organizations are critical to addressing this, supporting these initiatives, so self-employment through capacity building, training, as well as provision of credit. We're seeing initiatives again like Goal Uganda coming through with support of TechnoServe, as well as some other interventions by Mastercard Foundation to provide these skills and finance, as well as access to market for hundreds of these marginalized youth, including refugees and those with disabilities. To that regard, the nonprofit sector's strength lies in providing essential entrepreneurship skills, technical and digital, but also aligning with government policy to improve youth employment prospects in the country.
Roland, please run up.
Okay, sorry. Let me maybe skip this slide on technology and just summarize. So youth unemployment, particularly for marginalized youth in Uganda, is a significant challenge. The non-profit sector plays a role through provision of direct and indirect employment, although evidence of decent work is really minimal. A key finding from this literature review is that the lack of data, there's a significant lack of data on the number and quality of jobs that are created by NGOs. We also found in conclusion that NGOs should focus on high productivity sectors in the intervention, such as agriculture value addition, which requires skills development, as well as digital jobs, where we're seeing some NGOs already training youth. The informal economy or informal sector is also a vital sector for youth in the country, and NGOs could provide or better serve as ecosystem enablers through, again, provision of skills, e.g. via accelerators and access to capital. Going forward, we find that this research should look, or the next iteration of the research should look at addressing the glaring lack of, current and quality data on NGO employment interventions. And to this end, would, recommend a mixed method approach with a quantitative data collection on employment statistics and youth interventions, as well as qualitative research to understand the actual needs in the market. So I'll end here, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Roland, for such a great presentation. And I hope you are noting down your questions and interesting insights coming in from Uganda, where we have direct and indirect contributions from the NPOs and also the lack of data coming in. Moving on in the presentation, I'll also call on a colleague, Dr. Sylvester Senyo-Hove, to present us the findings from Ghana. Doc, we welcome. Please give us a quick introduction about yourself and then go into your presentation. You have 15 minutes to do this. Please put it in the presentation mode.
All right. Let's do that. Just a moment, okay. Not okay.
Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dennis, and greetings to everybody. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share the findings we got from Ghana. I think most of them aligns with what my colleague Roland presented, but I will still go through some other few issues that we discovered in Ghana. So as the topic suggests, we're looking at the contribution of NPOs creating dignified and fulfilling jobs for youth, particularly in Ghana. So the initial phase of this study was to have a brief overview of the situation in Ghana by way of a literature review. And I believe you all bear with me that Africa is a very youthful continent. The majority of the population are youth between 15 and 25 years. But we see that youth unemployment is a major issue in Africa. According to the African Development Bank report, we have 1/3 of the youth who are jobless and discouraged, and another third work in vulnerable jobs, and just 1 in 6 are employed for wages. So we see that when it comes to the issue of creating dignified and fulfilling jobs, most of the youth in Africa do not have it. And unemployment is also a major issue on the continent. And that is why there is a need for us to explore avenues where youth can gain a dignified and fulfilling job. Now, when we talk about a dignified and fulfilling job, what do we actually mean? Initial search from the literature suggests that it's anything that needs to be safe, stable, inclusive, and rewarding. Safe in the sense that employees or youth within our context can perform their task without fear of injury or exploitation. And it must be stable in the sense that they are able to receive fair, steady, and predictable pay for work, and inclusive, which means that it must include individuals from all walks of life, regardless of their conditions, situation, or region that they are coming from. And it must be rewarding. So a dignified and fulfilling job should provide access to skills training and opportunities for growth. Now, when we look at Africa, as I initially highlighted, we see that youth employment is a major issue, even though the government is putting in so many efforts to address this issue. But we also see that the government alone cannot do this. Other organizations need to also come on board to support this agenda. And that is where we are looking at the role that the non-profit sector can play, which is something that a lot of scholars have been highlighting. And then from the literature review, we see that the NPOs are putting in some effort, which suggests that when it comes to the issue of creating a dignified and fulfilling job, the NPO can actually contribute to this. So as I indicated, this literature review was actually focusing on Ghana. And then when we look at the situation in Ghana, we see that the youth underemployment rate, which actually refers to the underutilization of the working population's potential for productivity, is above 50%. So if you talk about underemployment, then basically the issue of dignifying and fulfilling job is at stake over here. And then also the youth unemployment rate in Ghana is around 12%, which is way above the average unemployment rate in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, despite the government effort to help create jobs for the youth, we see that there have been several challenges regarding funds and then sustainability and the creation of dignified and fulfilling jobs. Hence, considering this issue, there is growing interest among stakeholders of NPOs that could contribute to the creation of dignified and fulfilling job for the youth, which is the main focus of this study. So these were the main questions that was actually guiding the literature review. And how did we find answers to these questions? First of all, we had a search period between 1992 to 2023. So the study began from 1992 in the sense that the Fourth Republic of Ghana actually initiated several reforms that supported the operations of the NPOs in Ghana. And that is why the search period actually began from that. And then also 2023 was the recent year as at the time of this study. We used several databases, including Google Scholar, Scopus, and then Web of Science for the literature search. And some of the keywords we were using includes youth unemployment, Ghana, dignifying and fulfilling jobs, among others. And those keywords were very, very important to ensure that we find relevant literature that is actually speaking to the issue that we are interested in. And the other keywords includes non-profit organization or non-governmental organization, because these words are mostly used interchangeably. Now, beyond the academic literature, we also see that other international organizations have provided some reports on this situation. Hence, it was also important for us to explore some of these platforms to understand the issue or the role of the NPOs in creating dignified and fulfilling jobs. And so we had some databases that were considered, which includes the USAID, the Civicus, the website from the Lilly School of Philanthropy. We also had the NPO site from Ghana, and also the World Bank databases, among others. And these were very, very important in order not to limit ourselves in terms of the scope of insight that is available. And that provides a strong foundation on what needs to be done subsequently after this research. Now, in terms of the analysis, we followed a thematic approach. And the teams were structured according to the main questions that I initially highlighted. This is the 5 guiding questions. So that is how the review was done. Now, just to have a brief overview of the situation in Ghana, we see that even though unemployment in Ghana is a bit volatile, it is still very high. However, the data over here was only considering the age range between 15 and 24. And then studies suggest that if we had to extend it to that of 35, according to the original definition of youth, this unemployment rate is going to increase. Now, in terms of the tertiary graduates in Ghana, we see that this number has been increasing over the period. If you look at 2015 to 2021, the number of tertiary graduates are always on the increase. And what is the implication? It tells us that a lot of youth are entering the labor market every year, which suggests the need for us to provide avenues where these individuals who are entering the labor market can gain a good job, a fulfilling and a dignifying job. And this is also a brief overview of the labor force in Ghana. Now, in Ghana, when we talk about NPO, we basically looking at a non-profit organization or non-governmental legal person or association organization voluntarily established that primarily engages in mobilizing and using resources for purposes such as charitable, religious, cultural, educational, social, or communal purposes, or for carrying out of other types of not-for-profit purposes and public good in the public interest. So basically, a non-profit organization from the Ghanaian context is any organization that exists to support the organization without any profit motive. In Ghana, the NPOs are categorized into community-based NPOs, national NPOs, and international NPOs. And these are further classified into what? The faith-based organizations, which includes religious organizations or churches. And we also have the civil society organization, the non-governmental organization, and philanthropic organizations, which engage in job creation, advocacy, and also help to combat poverty. Now, aside from the non-profit organization, the regulatory body of the non-profit organization in Ghana suggests that the number of NPOs registered in Ghana has been increasing exponentially. If you look at the number as at 2009, the registered NPOs was at 4,463. And then in 2021, the total registered NPOs was around 10,474, which suggests more than 100% increase in the total registered NPOs in Ghana. And what does it tell us? It tells us that a lot of NPOs are entering the market, which suggests that they can contribute a lot to the economy. Now, let's look at some of the interventions provided by NPOs in Ghana. Now, one of the key things that NPOs do to support in creating dignified and fulfilling jobs for the youth in Ghana is through government collaboration. So in Ghana, we have something called the National Service Scheme, which is compulsory for every graduate in Ghana. So right after your tertiary education, you are given 1 year to serve the community to enhance your capacity and provide avenue for acquiring a dignified and fulfilling job. And we also have the GIDA, which is the Ghana Youth Employment and Entrepreneurial Development Agency. Now, when you look at these initiatives, NPOs contribute greatly to these things. They provide opportunities for some of these tertiary students through the National Service Scheme and the GIDA. And then a report by one of the scholars highlighted that the NPOs have managed to provide training to about 41,000 applicants. The other thing that NPOs provide is capacity building and then skill training. And this happens through entrepreneurship programs for young people in order to launch their own businesses, create jobs for others, and eventually become job creators themselves. And some of these initiatives from the NPOs include the Paceway, which is the pathway for sustainable employment for women and youth in Ghana. We can also talk about the YOTA, which is the Youth Opportunity and Transformation in Africa. And then we have the strategic approaches to girls' education, popularly known as STAGE. And about 10,000 girls between the ages of 15 and 19 sign up for this this program in order to gain some vocational skills and also to accelerate their learning program. We also have the apprenticeship program in order to help them gain exposure on the job and gain relevant skills. Some of the initiatives that are provided by the NPOs in this regard includes the YEDA program, which is the Youth Inclusive Entrepreneurial Development Initiative for Employment, and then the YOTA, as well as the Step Up, which is the Seamstress Training Program initiatives, are all part of this. And these are all initiatives from the NPOs in Ghana, and they are meant to empower the young people to gain hands-on skills that will enhance their livelihood. And we also have education and scholarship. So beyond the NPOs providing training, skills, and job opportunities for the youth, they also support some of the youth education. Some of the initiatives include are coming from the World Vision Ghana, and then the School of Life Girls Education Unit are all some of the initiatives that are provided by the NPOs. Because in a nutshell, if the youth gain the right education, obviously they would have the right knowledge, the right skills that will put them on the platform for gaining a dignifying job. Now, other interventions also include the microfinance and grants. For instance, the Vision Fund Ghana provides loans to project recipients to improve their companies. In 2020, we find that about 6,000 community members accessed loans of about 3 million Ghana cedis, which benefited about 20,000 children and youth. And we also have the Social Enterprise and Investment Initiative, which was initiated by Meripa Capital SME Fund, and also the Fidelity Young Entrepreneurs Fund. And beyond what the NPOs are doing to support the youth in gaining a dignified and fulfilling job, we also see that the youth also plays a significant role in improving the non-profit structures in Ghana. And one of the key things they do is through volunteerism, because we see that staff retention among NPOs in Ghana is a major issue. Hence, most NPOs actually rely on these volunteers and interns to help with their staffing shortfall. And also, due to financial resource constraints, NPOs use the youth volunteers to offer their services. And by so doing, as the youth volunteer and work as interns in these organizations, it provides avenue for skills development, capacity building, which opens several opportunities for them to gain a dignified job. Now, this is just a brief overview of the employment situation in Ghana. We see that when it comes to the public sector, they contribute about 6%, according to the GLS report in 2016-17. And then the NGOs are contributing less than 1%, which suggests more room for improvement. And now, if we are to disaggregate them into various age categories, that is 15 to 24, 25 to 35, and also the total, we see that still the contribution of the NGOs or the non-profit organization is very low. Hence, there is a need for the non-profit sector to beef up their initiatives to support the youth in gaining a dignified and fulfilling job. And these are some of the pockets of opportunities that could be considered. In the interest of time, I will just emphasize that of the green jobs, given that these days the world is talking about sustainability, climate-related issues. I think the NPOs can focus on this aspect as well, and that would provide more opportunities for the youth. And also, in terms of the youth, there are other individuals that should also be factored into whatever initiative that are created by the NPOs, and that includes the disabled youth, the young women, rural communities, and even the youth with criminal records. And also, they can also venture into technology. In this fourth industrial revolution, technology is very, very important, and the non-profit sector can leverage this to create more opportunities for the youth. These were some of the challenges that were discovered. In a nutshell, we see that even though the non-profit sector actually putting in some effort to support youth in gaining some sort of employment, however, the studies discovered that there is still more room for improvement, particularly when it comes to the youth gaining a dignifying and fulfilling job. Hence, when they consider all of these pockets of opportunities and also leverage technology, we believe that the issue of youth unemployment in Ghana will be addressed and will also gain very good job that would be more fulfilling. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Interesting presentation. There's more room for improvement for the nonprofit organizations in Ghana. Our presenters, we are not doing well with time, so please let's make sure that we stick to the 15 minutes. I hope you are also noting down your questions. Let's keep the chat interactive and make sure that you post your questions, or we'll also give you opportunity to ask those questions after the discussants have shared their. Please, let's quickly go into our next presentation, which will be done by Dr. Carlos Fernandez. That will be the literature review for Mozambique. Doc, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So let me start first to say that I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, and I hope that everyone had access to the report, the Mozambique report that we did, and there you can find tables and figures on all these issues about economic contribution of the nonprofit sector to Mozambican economy. So yeah, okay. This is a work that we the Center of African Studies is also engaged in this research, right? In partnership with CAPSI and the Wits University, and we are mainly three main principal researchers: Monica Frederico, which is the coordinator of the project, the empirical project especially, and also the whole project. And then myself, Carlos Fernandez, and Elio Maung, which we both did the literature review for that we're going to present here. So of course, this presentation is going to be based on that date, on that discussion that we did, right? So for in that matter, my presentation will focus mainly on 5 points. One is, to try to provide a critical overview of the existing knowledge, for the Mastercard project, research projects. and then also to position, in certain way, to position the research within the broader academic conversations on, showing what is already known, some gaps, and also what this literature that we reread can teach us. It can, in terms of theoretical insights, methodological insights for this project. And of course, in the end, I will show some numbers, some statistics, and actually doing this literature review for me myself was a real challenge, as I'm not an expert on these kind of issues. I do other kind of research, but I'm deeply engaged on these kinds of things and learning more and reading. And me, I've Elio a bit more engaged on that kind of research. But yeah, so this is the overview of what I'm going to discuss. And first of all, let me give you an historical context, because I think this is important, even I will discuss in later time the challenge that we are facing now, interviewing and engaging with the NPOs and on the field, right? In Mozambique, we don't use the term non-profit organizations or non-profit sector. The term that has been normally used is NGOs, civil society organizations, NGOs, and that type of thing. And NGOs, let's say, it's a recent phenomenon. Let's say it's a post-colonial phenomenon, right? And I think, especially after the post-1990s periods, where Mozambique entered into a liberalization economy and all the kinds of, and multi-party elections, privatizations, and all the kind of thing. And then there was a boom of civil society organizations, but there is also a legacy of authoritarianism and a kind of a political culture of violence during the first decades of independence, where you did not have independent civil society organizations, right? This was a period of one-party states, and all the organizations that we could call like mass organizations, youth national organizations, the women's, were a branch of the party states, right? So, and that kind of legacy influence even today, and I think I will discuss later on when the challenge that we're having, and to engage with the NPOs, and on our perspective, this is also linked to that kind of political culture of violence, that kind of historical legacy. So they, as in the case of Uganda, they were also a urban phenomenon. They were born in cities, mostly by middle-class people, that trying to set up the first NGOs and these kinds of things. And through the literature, we have been seeing that there is different views of what civil society is, right? Some linked that, some, for instance, links civil society with the democratic governance and active citizenship, especially during the periods of the liberalizations of politics. And I think the main thread of the literature that came up in Mozambique was linked with that kind of political discussions of civil society organizations, right? But there are authors now that are saying that that kind of literature that was very much framed by a Western concept of civil society, that did not capture the complexities and heterogeneities of what was happening in Mozambique during that 19 period, right? And for instance, the role of the churches, the mosques, and that kind of thing. So and some authors are doing a kind of revisionist approach on the issue of civil society and saying that, you know, the majority of the Mozambican people did not perceive, you know, any contradictions between supporting democracy and backing traditional leaders, or being in you know, engaging with charge and all on all and some of these kind of things. So in terms of you know, the literature, as I said, the main thread a dominant part of the literature are concerned about questions on the political role of NPOs, NGOs, civil society organizations, you know, in terms of strengthening democracy, governments, and active citizenship. And actually, most of the funding from the civil society organizations, from external donors, came with that kind of agenda. You know, we were in the context of liberalization of politics, economy, and that kind of issue became dominant, you know, to try. So most of the literature was focused on that kind of issues, right? And the second epistemic thread focused on youth employment, women's access to the markets, the youth political role. You know, also the issue of gender became also a very important issue to discuss, right? But of course, the gaps are on the economic contributions of the NPOs. You know, there are a lot of studies on rural development, on the peasantry, on the role of the agriculture, on you know, the role of NGOs in rural areas. You know, their impact in issues that are more concerned with the political arena than specifically with the economic contributions of the NGO. So this is really a big gap, and I think that the Mastercard project is going to make a breakthrough in these kind of issues, because actually there is not a lot of studies that deal with the economic contributions, right? And try to see, of course, there is one study from Carlos Arnaldo and Rogers Ancin, which is going to be the discussant. That I think it's a seminal work in the Mozambican literature, because it gave, you know, tried to bring a socioeconomic profile of the youth in Mozambique, right? And stating right at the beginning that, you know, access to employment is still one of the major challenges for Mozambican youth, especially among women. You know, for instance, in 2017, as they say, 85% of youth were employed in the informal sector, and I will discuss later some of these kind of statistics on the youth employment. So there is also some literature that tries to balance this kind of disparity. Of course, this literature acknowledge there is gender discrepancies between boys and girls, women and men. But for instance, a work by Arau is trying to see also, you know, some similarities within these two groups. You know, although in the end there's gender discrepancies, but for instance, they argue that young women in Maputo and Beira in the center of Mozambique have the same educational attainments as the young men, and both target groups are likely to drop school, but of course for different reasons. You know, the girls related, as we discussed, you know, with early marriage, premature unions, and men, you know, trying to find jobs. You know, there is, in the Mozambican literature, for instance, there's a lot of discussion on the migration to South Africa. You know, this is even from colonial times, you know, all the center of Mozambique, certain the south, okay, Nyambane, Gaza, and Maputo, going to South Africa to work on the mines, but also on the other countries in the region. So this is also interesting to see this kind of literature that discusses similarities, although acknowledging the discrepancies in the literature. But of course, there is also theoretical insights that we are learning from this review. And I think one of the things is the Roland from Uganda, when he's presenting, discussing, for instance, the concept of marginality and youth in the margins, referring them as this kind of disadvantaged people on the edge of society, and also linking marginality to our intersectional dimension that we find also in Mozambique. That marginality is also about cuts across gender, ethnicity, age, disability, sexual orientation, class, and it's interesting that for the specific project, the Uganda reports mentioned the northern Uganda as the most paradigmatic example of the young people, which is in the margins. In Mozambique today, we can say maybe, because also besides the gender disparities, there is also regional disparities in terms of access to employment, the rates of unemployment in Mozambique. And this is also the legacy of colonial, or how colonial economy was structured in Mozambique, the south of Mozambique being a reservoir of labor force to South Africa, and the Portuguese colonial government dependent on that kind of revenues, and the center and the north being centered on the economic plantations. And today we see these, I think in Mozambique, the people that are the youth that are most marginalized are in the north of Mozambique, and especially in Cabo Delgado, where the conflicts are. And these conflicts also, we found in the literature, are also related to these youth grievances, right? High unemployment rates are in the north. Young people are not employed. The structure of the economy that is based on the extractive nature of the economy, although agriculture is the main, attract of youth in terms of working. It's 70% of the youth are on agriculture, but at the same time, it's a structure of economy that is based on the extractive of natural resources, and most of these people are not being part of that kind of dynamics. There is that kind of structure of the economy is ineffective in reducing poverty, especially in rural areas, right? And we know that agricultural sector plays an important role for being responsible for employing the majority of the population, but also the youth population. Of course, we can talk about the urbanization, some youth that are migrating to the urban areas, but it's still there. So that's why it's important for us, not just the NGOs are mostly in that kind of areas, targeting, for instance, rural areas and not in the urban areas. But they realize, not just the NGOs, but the literature realize that kind of economy structure does not translate into significant creation of formal and productive jobs for the youth. As a consequence, we have this pattern of vulnerability, this pattern of unemployment, economic exclusion of the populations, the most of the young people being in informal, precarious, and unstable jobs without social protection. And I think this is an argument that Ruth Castel Branco and some authors from the two Mozambican research institutions, independent from the state, that are doing interesting work. You know, the Institute of Social Economic Studies and also the Observatorio do Meio Rural, which is a research institution that works more with rural dynamics of the research. And I think Mbeki mentioned the students that are also within this big project of the Mastercards, you know, that is not just research, but also integrating students to in their PhDs to do this kind of thing. We have a Mozambican student, Yara Nova. I think she was also work as a researcher at that research institution, independent from the state, but is also working within the scope of this project, you know. But I think she's looking more on the rural dynamics of the contributions of the NPOs to employment in Mozambique. And so this is the concept of marginality. So it's very important, as I said, but there is also other important concepts. The role of NPOs, for instance, right? If you see the Mozambican literature, there is two dimensions of this literature. One that is has a more positive, see a more positive role of the NGOs, and the other part sees a kind of negative role of the NPOs in Mozambique, working in Mozambique. So some says that NPOs have played active role in mitigating weakness in the sector, you know, acting through projects that combine, you know, social innovation, capacity building, you know, access to microcredits, you know, also in terms of giving skills, you know, working skills and also, you know, there is in this positive literature, they also emphasize the political role of the NPOs, you know, in terms of the kind of political change in Mozambique. And this is related to what I said in the beginning of the post-19 and all that culture of political violence. And, you know, all the NGOs thought that, you know, we have to support NGOs on the sphere of political intervention, because this is the moment to make an active citizens in Mozambique, right? And this produce actually interesting outputs in Mozambique. Not, for instance, in terms of agricultural policies, and I think the research institutions that I mentioned that works on peasantry, that they were very critical in terms of pressuring the government and changing policies in the rural areas, but also on gender issues. There's a lot of NGOs in Mozambique, local NGOs, that are working on gender, that were very important in changing, for instance, the domestic violence laws in the parliament. They were the ones who pushed that issue in the parliament in Mozambique. And the changes that we have today, in terms of, you know, this progressive law that we have in gender today, was basically the contribution of the NPOs, right? The contribution of the NPOs. But also there is negative, I think in 2 minutes I finish. There is also negative approach to the NPOs, that they say that they have the degree of success that they have, it's very small, in the small scale, very local. And, you know, the scope of development cannot be distributed exclusively to this kind of single interventions. That, you know, development means integrated, holistic approaches, that the NGOs cannot do that. And also that the NPOs in rural areas, they reduce the complexity of, you know, the social and cultural complexity of the rural areas, you know, and not paying attention to issues like ethnic issues, gender, class divisions, even within the peasantry. You know, for instance, people who go to work in South African mines, you know, they acquire not just the means of modernization, but also money, and then come back to Mozambique. They have more money than the other peasant. When they are in Mozambique, they are peasants. When they are in South Africa, they are proletarians. And that kind of dynamics make them a unique class. You know, they are not a homogeneous peasantry class there. So these kind of issues, sociological issues, anthropological, that NGOs cannot capture, and the issues that can, you know, create more inequalities. I will drop to the some of statistics. You know, we are working this project. We are working only in Maputo province and Maputo city. Maputo province, you know, gathers different districts, and some that are much closer to the rural areas, because it's also important. And you know, we in Mozambique, for instance, we have 17,548 young people from the age of 15 to 34, which is, you know, the Mozambican official definition of youth in Mozambique. And you know, this is 43% of the total population from 15 years old to more than 16 years old. So we had actually to do an extra work, because the National Institute of Statistics, they don't disaggregate this data in terms of, you know, young people from the target group that the Mastercard project are doing, right? So we had to disaggregate and make some mathematics and statistics to have these kind of numbers. You know, 6,760 are men, and 10,000.
Please.
Yes. And also, okay, the NPOs in Mozambique, and this the target group that we're working on. We have 2,190 NPOs, 221 in the Maputo province, and 1,069 in Maputo city. Yes, so I'm sorry. I will stop here.
All right, thank you so much, and such an interesting presentation. So because of time, I will move quickly straight to our last presentation by Dr. Eliano Chipeta. Please, Dr. Eliano, go for it.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, colleagues, and good afternoon, our visitors. Thank you for joining us in these presentations. Okay, so I'll be taking you through the literature review that was done from Zambia. The role of this literature review was just to understand the landscape of the nonprofit sector in the country, as well as determine the appropriate methodology in order to address our research questions. So this literature review was conducted around 2023 into 2024 and subsequently published recently. So some of the dates and the citations here could be outdated. Just put that into consideration. So just to give you the background, I think it's becoming common knowledge that youth populations in Africa are rising, and South Africa is not unique to this challenge. Should I say Zambia is not unique. Since independence in 1964, Zambia's population has grown significantly. Now, as of 2021, we are looking at numbers of 19 million of population, and most of these are sitting around the ages of 15 and 24, or an average of 16 years compared to the global average of 29. So we can see that Africa is becoming, or increasingly becoming, youth. And the problem now in Zambia, many of these, around 43% of the youth, this is as of 2022, are not in any education, employment, or training. And they are kind of like marginalized. We can categorize them like that. So we've also noted that majority of these are sitting in the informal sector or working in the informal sector, or doing activities within the informal sector, and this is around 43%. And most of them are in households. Some of them are working in households, and some only like 30% approximately sitting in the formal sector. So we can see that if we juxtapose this with the Sustainable Development Goal number 8, we see that achieving this by 2030, there is a lot of work that needs to be done in Zambia. And this brings me to maybe looking into the nonprofit sector, which is our area of interest. How can this sector now assist us in contributing to achieving this goal by 2030? So, but maybe before we call upon the nonprofit sector, let's understand what this nonprofit sector is in Zambia, and how we define it and how we categorize it and all that aspect. So in Africa in general, nonprofit sector, sometimes called civil society or nonprofit institution, it has been called upon as a significant force in transforming African socio-political landscape. And in Zambia alone, it engages in addressing rural poverty, youth marginalization, and also issues of limited opportunities. And this it gives us an opportunity to understand that the sector has potential to address socioeconomic ills rampanting our youth in Zambia. However, looking at the extant literature, we see that yes, the nonprofit sector is doing some research on the economic contribution to some extent, maybe looking at other aspects like managing stakeholder relations, governance structures, examining their challenges and opportunities. Some research is there, but when we looked deeper, we could not really understand what research is saying about the economic contribution of the sector. So that kind of like showed us a gap in the literature that we aim to address in this project. And to do this project, we have a few thematic areas that we spelled out to focus our research to address that problem. So the economic contribution of the nonprofit sector, and not only looking at the economic contribution in general, but understanding what the quality of work in terms of, is it dignified and fulfilling among the youth in Zambia? And obviously, the sector is quite broad. We had to dissect it into the subsectors to understand the subsector contributions. And obviously, there will always be emerging gaps in any research. What are the emerging gaps within the sector that we can amplify the voice there, or we can actually highlight those issues for our funders in in the non-profit sector to kind of like pour in their resources to address this challenge, and also the possibilities and opportunities for increased employment in the sector. So to do this literature review, I had to have a particular methodology in order to leave a stone unturned, because that was the idea of really unraveling what is there in the literature. So a comprehensive literature review was conducted, mainly based on grounded desk review. And the focus was on exploring literature, highlighting the extent of the quality and the quantity of employment within the sector. So I used online databases such as Google Scholar, Web of Science, Scopus, and other research engines. The key words that we use particularly were nonprofit sector, civil society organizations, NGO, community-based organizations, and so on. But this was a little bit limited because some of the rich literature is sitting elsewhere, not in these search engines. So we had to consult some gray literature, including government reports, working papers, policy briefs, practitioner documents, and even talking to people on the ground just to understand the diversity or dynamics within the sector, and maybe understand where to look to really understand the scale and scope of this the activities in this sector. So just for us to have an understanding of what we mean by economic contribution, in broad, we can say it's a measure of gross change in economic activity resulting from various factors such as industries, events, and policies within a sector or within an economy. So in Zambia, in this case, we looked at the sectors that are contributing to the economy per se, and the main sectors that were arising here were in mining, agriculture, manufacturing, service, infrastructure, development, government policies, fiscal management, and foreign direct investment. But among these, the common, like where we could see activity among youth employment were mainly in the mining, agriculture, industrial, and service production sectors. So now the challenge was to further locate what we mean by economic contribution, how much of this sector is really engaging in providing direct employment or even indirect employment to our youth in Zambia. So the problem here was also to understand the nonprofit sector because of the lexicon discrepancy within the country. It's mainly called civil society, and it further changes into understanding it as an NGO sector because that's what is common, non-government organizations in the country. So I further looked into understanding the registration status of the landscape of the nonprofit sector within the country. So we could see that there is some presence of formal and informal organizations operating in the country. By formal, I mean those registered under the institutional framework drafted by the Ministry of Community Development and Social Services, and those informal were operating outside the framework of the corporate, private, and public sector institution. So according to the SDG Philanthropy platform that is published in the country, the nonprofit sector promotes, among other things, civil education, advocacy, human rights, social welfare services, and development, and they operate across the country. And I must mention that I think the birth of their operation trajectory within the country was kind of formed by the way the country developed. I think the introduction of the railway line in the country, most of them were situating themselves close to the infrastructure for ease of access, and mainly in the main provinces in the country. So, however, I also noticed that beyond having a framework and a policy non-governmental organization framework that was guiding how the nonprofits should be registered, there are so many other bodies that are now coming out of this particular framework that are registering these nonprofits. So among these, we have the Patents and Companies Registration Agency and Registrar of Societies, the Registrar of Non-Governmental Organizations in the Ministry I think I cut it, it's in the Ministry of Youth, Sports and, in the Ministry of Non-Governmental Organizations, something like that. I think I've just forgotten. Development and social services. So the problem now arises whereby you'd find organizations having multiple registrations across these various registration bodies. And that limited my understanding to how many are actually registered, because you could find those repetitions. And this was also confirmed at some point when we're doing the stakeholder meeting in the country, that they are trying to amalgamate these various registration bodies, and so that at least an organization should be registered under one type of registration and doing the actual work that it is registered under. So that was a challenge now to understand the scope, because as much as I would want to see, and some figures were coming up, it was difficult to really understand the entire scope without being exposed to some repetitions. So this dichotomy of formal and informal in Zambia, again, also some are not registered. So the economy is quite broad in the country, but because of this dynamic, we could not ascertain the numbers. So along with the fragmented registrations and regulatory framework, like I just expounded, complicates the efforts of understanding the actual size. But as of 2007, the structure of the civil society included, we could see some trade unions in there, local community-based organizations, informal civil groups, religious organizations, local NGOs. And among these, 41 were registered under the trade unions, according to the 2007 data, and 11,000 were under the NGO registration, and then 14,000 were religious groups. So we can see that religious groups are taking a huge chunk of the pie in terms of really engaging into the non-profit sector and engaging into assisting the socio-economic ills within the country. And this is not a surprise, looking at the country being leaning more towards the religion, like mainly Christianity. So I would see a trajectory going towards that direction. But this is not enough to really ascertain, to sit in a position to understand that this is the scope of the size of the non-profit sector in Zambia. And this led to us identifying that there's a pressing need to understand the current size and the impact of the sector in Zambia. So what is this sector doing? The limited knowledge that we have around the organizations that are there, what are they doing? So this, as I said, is quite broad and spread across various activities. So the sector saw its significant, particularly in 1991, of the period of economic political liberalization in Zambia. And as of 2021, the sector recorded contributions of approximately 6.6% of overall employment. And this is quite a small number because this sector can employ as much more. We've got records of elsewhere in the Western world where it's one of the biggest employers of I mean, it provides employment to various people in its economies. And at some point, I saw somewhere that it comes to about 10% in contribution. So Zambia is really inching closer, but there's still some work to be done here. And among these, only 5% are youth, 0.5% are youth. So you can see that majority of the people that are employed in the sector are actually youth. And like I said, the NGO sector is what is prevalent in the country. They employ about 4,000 or close to 4.5 youth. And these are mainly in the faith-based organizations where they employ among so we have the 4,482 that are employed in the NGO, and the faith-based organizations that are they employ about north of 9,000, which is close to approximately 10,000 as of 2021. And international organizations employ about 962. So altogether, this was totaling around 15,345. And the type of work that, or the activities that are happening in this sector, we have an organization called GWEL, Girls Education and Women Empowerment Livelihoods. It's a project that focuses on improving livelihoods of extremely poor girls. These are marginalized girls aged between 14 and 18, and mainly in the rural areas. So this organization helps them to succeed in their education. And this organization is actually supported by the World Bank, and it provides programs like life skills training, business skills and savings in technical services. And also it has programs that has impacted about 39 districts across the country, out of 116 districts in Zambia. So we can see that this is one of the biggest organizations that is doing some work, and I could see from the contribution of the World Bank. Another organization that we're seeing here is also the Youth Skills Enterprise Initiative, the program that targets marginalized youth. So these are kids that are sitting in the streets, and so they are brought on the project to kind of like provide them with life skills training and even some business skills. There's other smaller organizations that are running in the country. I could not bring them here just to try and limit my discussions and save time, but there's a bit of activity around the nonprofit sector in Zambia that is contributing to youth employment. So now, like I said, we have to understand economic contribution, but we cannot limit it at just understanding the size. What is the quality of this work that is provided by the sector? So we all know that working is a fundamental right, a human right, and that is universally recognized as an inherent part of the human dignity for persons of all ages, and essential for realizing other human rights. So when we are talking about dignified and fulfilling work, this is a multidimensional concept. And this is what I also learned when I was doing my research in the literature for Zambia. So for Zambia. And the common elements that were emerging from the data or from the literature, they were saying this should mean fair and predictable income, safety and non-exploitative environment, working in a safe and non-exploitative environment, respect and recognition, purpose, personal growth and self-worth, gender inclusive and protection from harmful practices. So we can see that having various phases of this definition, this is an important, but it's also very complex to measure. So this kind of like gave us some light to understanding how we should approach measuring dignified and fulfilling work when we are designing our methodology. So experiences of quality of work, okay. Experiences of quality work, like I said, we had to hear from, just like flesh out information from the literature to see if the work that this nonprofit sector is providing is indeed dignifying and fulfilling for the youth. And we could see that most of the youth were worried about the experience of the work that they are being provided. There's high levels of employment insecurity, both informal and informal. Most of them are even engaging in casual work, but still it's very volatile. And most of the NPOs that are employing the youth are really just taking them as unpaid volunteers as a cost-saving measure. And further research here is needed to understand the scope, because we are limited in data. This was analyzed based on the few projects that are running in the country. But there's need for further research to understand the dynamics in the country using quantitative analysis, and it becomes the youth project. So subsectoral contributions, and Simon and Ann Heiner at some point defined subsectors of the nonprofit sector. This was a big project that was done years ago and included 54 countries in Africa. So they kind of like categorize which sectors we should focus on in understanding the subsectors. So if I juxtapose the subsectors of Ann Heiner and looking at what is prevailing in Zambia, I could see that there is social service sector that is appearing there, religious congregations that are common in there, and then there's others that are not specified in there that helped us to also understand other dimensions of the nonprofit sector, like those in the grassroots organizations, or formally constituted organizations, umbrella organizations, and platforms and consultation forums. So this helps us to broaden our definition of what we mean by the nonprofit sector. So looking at the literature, we could see some emerging gaps that where the nonprofit sector could engage in to uplift the youth out of their socioeconomic ills. And most of these, the two that I could easily point out here, are increased access to education. Our youth in Zambia, there's high levels of school dropout, especially towards the tertiary education. So there is potential there for nonprofit sector to come and assist the youth in Zambia. And I think access to digital literacy as well to advance e-learning capabilities, as we're inching closer to AI. And I think our youth, we can see them really interested in understanding things, looking at using AI to express themselves, learning how to use these digital items or could aid them in accessing some level of employment in the economy. So the government policy in Zambia is quite rigid. It has aimed at promoting youth employment, including the National Youth Policy Employment Act, Educational Act, National Development Act, and Skills Development Act. However, its effectiveness in implementing those policies is actually mixed. We see some realizing their goals, strategic goals, and some experiencing some challenges, including poor implementation or disconnect between policy formulation and actual execution, leading to limited impact on youth employment rates. So I could see that I think the opportunity here is for government to collaborate with other sectors, and in this case, collaborate with the nonprofit sector. So I would raise the arm for nonprofit sector to say engage with the government, maybe provide vocational training and skills development programs tailored to the needs of the youth, because that's where the challenge is. And also the nonprofit sector will play a crucial role in advocating for policy reforms and raising awareness about youth employment issues, helping them to bridge this gap between youth and government initiatives. And the nonprofit sector could also explore to enhance operations in the agriculture sector. Because at some point I could see that unemployment was huge in the urban areas, but the rural youth were a bit more active in terms of employment because they are doing agricultural activities. And like I said, agriculture is one of the contributors of the economy, and Zambia having a rich resource of water, I see there's potential there for the nonprofit sector to also engage in some activities there. I will stop there for now due to the interest of time. Thank you so much, Chair, and I hand over to the discussant. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the interesting presentation. I see some of the charts that people are asking, how do we conceptualize dignified and fulfilling? I see Eleanor's presentation highlighting some of them. Yeah, we are not doing well with time, so we apologize for that. I will ask the next speakers, the discussants, to please use 5 minutes each to reflect on these presentations and then the findings from the literature review. So I'll start with Dr. Moses Okech for Uganda. Please go for it. You are muted. Hello, Dr. Moses. If Dr. Moses is not ready, we'll start with Dr. Paul Apia Konedu from Ghana to also share his reflections on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dennis. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, so to discuss the literature in Ghana, as Dr. Sylvester highlighted, youth unemployment in Ghana remains one of the highest in Africa. And per the background that Dr. Sylvester gave, youth unemployment in Ghana stands at about 12%. But that aside, underemployment rates exceeds 50%, which is very high. Rising graduate unemployment is the order of the day in Ghana. And since 2015, every other year, we have the numbers of graduates coming out of our institutions increasing. And the Ghana Statistical Service reports recently showed that out of the over 200,000 graduates that are coming out of our educational institutions every year, just about 10% are able to find sustainable jobs after national service. That is a worrying trend. And if you've been following developments in Ghana, what happened yesterday at the Ewak Stadium during the military recruitment exercise? A stampede leading to the death of 6 people and more than 25 injuries, some of them very serious ones, attest to the fact that the youth are desperate for jobs. So the question is, what are NGOs or NPOs, non-profit organizations, doing to support the government and the private sector in addressing the issue of youth unemployment? NPOs in Ghana play vital role through entrepreneurship and vocational training, skills development initiatives, providing scholarships and grants, as Dr. Sylvester highlighted. However, their impacts have been quite minimal. And in terms of direct employment, as it came out clearly in Dr. Sylvester's presentation, in terms of direct employment, NPOs account for less than 1% of employment in Ghana, even though the number of registered NPOs in Ghana have risen from 4,463 in 2009 to 10,474 in 2021. And as we speak, the numbers are still increasing. But in terms of impacts, it has been very minimal. And probably that relates to sustainability in terms of funding and also in terms of structures to ensure long-term sustainability. They are also under-supported, as reported by studies such as SAPON 2022 and USAID 2025. So the question is, what can government do? Or what are the policy implications? What can be done to enhance the impacts of NPOs in Ghana? USAID study in 2015 recommended partnership in terms of funding. I've been training a number of these youths or SME owners. And what happens is that usually we have the same people going through trainings by the government and also by MPOs. When you talk to them, they will tell you that we have had enough of these trainings. What we need is a support to be able to buy industrial machines for the fashion designers, knitting machines. The hairdressers are asking for dryers. Those in agro processing are asking for support in any form, long-term, low interest, patient, long-term loans to be able to buy the kind of key implements that they need. And if there is a way government can support MPOs to be able to provide these grant funds, these blended funds, low interest funds to be able to buy the implements or materials that they need, that will go a long way to support or bring out a greater impact from the non-profit sector. Next, Kumi 2019, Husseini Eta 2022 also recommend that there should be a dedicated support funds and fiscal incentives for MPOs, especially those that are supporting the youths in different forms. MPOs in Ghana every year have to file their tax returns. They pay some fees. So for MPOs that are doing well, government can probably waive the fees for such MPOs to encourage them to do more. Other studies have recommended strengthening the legal and regulatory framework to promote transparency and collaboration. For most of these people that are setting up MPOs, if you interrogate them, you'll find out that for most of them, it's not really about making long-term impacts. It's about finding a way to assess grants for their private interests or for their private benefits. And most of these MPOs do not even have governance boards. So who is policing them? Who is making sure that they have systems in place to ensure transparency and accountability in the use of funds or grants that flow to them? That is one thing that has to be done. Just as companies listed on the stock market are regulated, they have to report. There should be a framework where MPOs are held accountable for the funds that they receive. And that will go a long way to ensure that they are using those funds for the right purposes. Research has also shown that MPOs in Ghana mostly depend on international donors. And when it happens that international funds are not coming, then they get into liquidity crisis, sometimes paying their workers or paying stipends to their voluntary staff become a problem. During COVID, when we had funds dry and a lot of these MPOs had to fold up because they do not have any alternative measures to ensure financial sustainability. It is also important to encourage domestic philanthropy, corporate social responsibility. And studies have recommended that governments can come out with policy to encourage, for instance, banks in Ghana to partner with MPOs through their CSR arms to make sure that they are supporting vulnerable segments of society, female-led businesses, business led by young people, even graduates coming out of our schools that need support to be able to scale up their inventions into commercial ventures. That is one thing that governments can do. And such businesses can be given tax incentives, maybe a 1%, 2% reduction in the tax rate for businesses that subscribe to such interventions. That will go a long way to ensure that big companies like MTN, like the banks that are making huge profits, channeling a part of their CSR budgets towards supporting MPOs to make the expected impacts. In terms of research gaps, what are the gaps in the literature that should attract the attention of research going forward? Studies like CEDO appear 2021, DASI 2020 have highlighted the fact that there's limited data on the quantitative impact of MPOs on youth employment. We have had a lot of fragmented interventions by MPOs, and in a lot of cases, monitoring is a problem. Institutions like Mastercard, under the Precision Quality Training Program, they have put a framework in place where they track these people after 5 years to make sure that they are measuring impacts. So if you are given a grant to buy an industrial machine, if you are given a grant to buy any implement, to what extent is that facilitating creation of employment for other young people? To what extent does that facilitate apprenticeship for people that need such kind of training programs? And so that is something where future research should begin to look at, quantitatively measuring the impact of MPOs in the long term in terms of job creation. Research should also gather data from individual MPOs, analyze job outcomes by sector, agriculture, education, ICT, also by location, urban, rural. In a lot of cases, there is limited coverage in the rural areas, with the exception of the north, where we have a lot of MPOs working in the very remote areas. When it comes to the south, a lot of the activities are concentrated in the urban centers without much attention in the very remote areas. And that is one area where research should be directed at trying to measure the extent to which MPOs are covering rural young people with their interventions. Also, few studies explore how MPOs create jobs for marginalized groups. We're talking about teenage mothers, talking about ex-convicts, talking about people with chronic diseases. To what extent are MPOs targeting them? We know institutions like Mastercard, Foundation International, Mastercard, for instance, under a precision quality training program, is targeting a minimum of 10% marginalized people and also 70% women. MPOs, there should be studies to explore the extent to which other organizations are also trying to integrate these marginalized groups into their interventions. Qualitative research should also be directed at understanding the inclusion of youth with disabilities, young women in rural areas, and also to explore the lived experiences of these marginalized groups or individuals that might have experienced or enjoyed interventions of MPOs, to find out the extent to which these interventions have been transformational and exactly what they need. There will be questions about whether the interventions are addressing the needs of the beneficiaries. And like I said, if you talk to most of these craftsmen, most of these MSME owners that are being supported, a lot of times they will tell you that beyond the trainings, beyond the mentorship, they also need funding, because most of them do not have the structures to go to the regular financial institutions to apply for loans. And even if they are getting the loans, interest rates in Ghana over 25%. If you have to go to the microfinance, you are talking about 60% and over. Some are getting interest at 10%. How do you survive as a small business with limited liquidity to be able to fund such loans? And so that is a challenge for most of these beneficiaries. Research should also assess which programs work best and why. So what kind of collaborations? Should government stay out of direct implementation and support MPOs with tax incentives provided to the private sector to support the MPOs? Should government provide direct funding to the MPOs, especially those that are doing well, like Comfort International in the case of Ghana, like World Vision, like Mastercard, with their activities, so they can scale up to be able to reach out to more youths? There should also be studies to examine links between MPO governance, funding sources, and program success. Usually, like I said early on, most of these MPOs do not have governance structures. They don't even have boards. So what is the link between an MPO having a board of governance, a proper working board, not just a rubber stamp board? Some of them, just to be able to access grants or government support or whatever, they just call people, put them together, but in a whole year, they will not even have meetings. They will not hold any board meeting. The board does not have any influence in terms of key decisions and how funds are allocated, and also in terms of accountability. So is there any link between MPOs that are properly functioning boards regarding the access to funds and also their long-term sustainability? I think that can inform government policy as to what policy measures should be adapted to encourage MPOs to establish governance boards. Also, studies should also look at long-term effects on income, skills, and job sustainability. So for these interventions, to what extent are they impacting the income levels of the youth that are being supported? To what extent are they building the skills and also the long-term job sustainability of youth that are being supported? Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Appiah, for the elaborate discussion that you've done. I know the issue when it comes to youth unemployment in the nonprofit sector is exciting, and we tend to speak more. Please, let's stick to 5 minutes. Dr. Moses Okech, please come in and speak to the issues of Uganda. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, everyone, and for these wonderful discussions. I just want to reflect a little bit on the literature review from Uganda, and allow me to thank Dr. Roland Banya for the great job done. Mine, I just really look at maybe some of the thoughts that might have not come out very clearly in the review, but also to open new grounds for discussion in terms of the contribution of the nonprofit sector in Uganda. The first point I want to reflect on is a policy issue. You heard from the literature that Uganda put in place a regulation in 2016, basically to guide the activities of the nonprofit organizations in the country. That is how it's being seen from the government side. But from a critical angle, people this as a way of putting restraints on the activities of nonprofit organizations. So depending really on where you stand, we tend to see these things differently. Now, the argument on the government side is that if NPOs are left unregulated, they could kind of have a skewed effect on the economic outcomes of the country. In that, government has got a very clear, national development plan that is renewed every 5 years, and all sectoral interventions are therefore supposed to feed into one or the other into the objectives of this national development plan. But so happens that by then, some of the NGOs were doing certain things, some which are really great, but then the way in which they were contributing to this plan was not clear. So government thought of having this for planning purposes and to ensure that there's a very clear sense of direction in the economy. Now, those on the other side say, well, this was a way of containing, containing non-profit organizations, especially those working in the areas of human rights and democracy. Now, of course, the question and the point of reflection I would want to pose for all of us and also for Roland is that much as the evidence came out that nonprofit organizations contribute positively to providing, jobs for the young people in the country, we also need to look at some bit of sectoral analysis, probably. If you look at the typologies of nonprofit organizations here, those working in the democratic space, the human rights, and other sensitive, areas have become less active in the last few years. Of course, we are all aware that there was a structure called Democratic Governance Facility, DGF, that was disbanded altogether by the government. And then we have also seen many other actors, especially in the human rights areas, that have become less active. So looking at all these, so I think when we are trying to categorize the contribution of the nonprofit organization to the economic development in the country, we should also bring in such disabling, what I call disabling factors. So I thought that reflection was important. But there's also the question of tracing the evidence of the contribution of NPOs. You talked about creation of enterprises. How do we get these attribution factors right? Which kind of enterprises are we talking about here? Although I really agree that the NPOs, I think one of their biggest contributions come more indirectly in terms of, the logistics support. I mean, an organization is set up, say, in northern Uganda in the area like Gulu. They do a lot of procurements from the local businesses. So all the money is going within the community. There are people who are service providers, leave alone the people who are actually actively employed. So there's both this direct and indirect pathways in the contribution, but someone might actually say the indirect contributions is quite a lot and remains one of the least the least documented in terms of, okay, how many people benefited from the presence of a nonprofit organization in a region, maybe in terms of providing transport services, printing services and other logistical services. So getting this right, I think really remains a task for us, both in doing reviews, but also in collecting data from the ground. The other point of reflection I wanted to bring here is we talk about agriculture being one of the biggest employers in the country, although it's also the least productive. Now, there've always been efforts to get more and more young people to actually play an active role in agriculture because the opportunities are actually there. But then agriculture remains unattractive to young people in Uganda, especially young people who are educated. Few of them really wants to get their hands dirty, but also they think agriculture is less profitable. So there have been people working in this space, trying to make agriculture attractive, but also making it more profitable. Talk of agri-tech industries and so on. Now, this is an opportunity, but again, it presents a challenge at the same time. When you think about the youth on the margin, the uneducated youth who may not have the kind of skills to play a very active role in the agri-tech space. So again, these kind of reflections probably need to be enhanced in further research. Then I look at the whole issue of the contribution in terms of self-employment, that NPOs, have largely contributed to getting young people into the space of self-employment. But there's been a debate on the distinction between self-employment and precarious work. We talk about precarity. Oftentimes when statistics are being collected in Uganda, you hear that, oh, Uganda is one of the most enterprising countries in the world. So what are they looking at? They're looking at the young man with a small stall selling chapati on the roadside, without looking at the details of whether this person is even making profits or anything. Of course, someone has been forced to go into self-employment because of lack of alternative. But in as far as how that business contributes productively to the livelihood of that person is something that really needs to be further analyzed. So there's need to do further exploration on these self-employment opportunities that we see around. Of course, as it came out also from the literature, the NPOs help really to create opportunities to some youth on the margin. For instance, if you think about youth, people with disability, it helps to reduce the stigma because it's one of the safe areas where people with disability really feel appreciated. They're given opportunities, through targeted interventions. Sometimes you find organizations purely, run by people with disabilities. So thereby, they gain their access to, dignity and they get some bit of fulfillment in what they're doing. So I think this is something also some area where we need to raise more evidence in order to strengthen these contributions. And I think lastly, also based on some recent developments, especially when we saw the donor funding kind of dwindling, We looked at USAID pulling out, but we also looked at some donor groups actually reducing funding in certain areas. There's now a growing shift in the country towards, the formation of community foundations. I think a very good number of people in the civil society have now realized that there's a lot of giving opportunity or giving potential within the communities where they've been working. So they're now shifting their focus from, looking for funding from the outside to in terms of encouraging people, communities, to create their own foundations, to do some kind of self-support groups. And there are also individuals, a good number actually, who have been working in these NGOs, who are now forming their own foundations because they've learned, they've internalized, and they've seen that this is actually quite impactful. So documentation of these community foundations, I think it's something that is still lacking, especially in Uganda, and yet they exist. You just need to maybe call a forum and start talking to people working in the philanthropy space, and you'll be amazed by how much individuals are doing in this space, but these go undocumented. So when looking at the literature of really the overall contribution of NPOs to the economic sector of Uganda, there's a lot that remains undocumented, and that remains a task, but it's also an opportunity for us who are in the research space. I stop there, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Moses Okech. You've taken more time, but we also ask our next speakers. We have 2 more speakers, and then we'll open it up. Our time is up, so we apologize. It will take maybe about 15 minutes more to run it up and give you opportunity to also share something. So I'll quickly ask Professor Rogers from Mozambique to share something, his thoughts on the presentation.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having us. I'm really running out of time because I was supposed to be teaching class that started 10 minutes ago. I thought the program would be more or less running within the time, so I will make my comments as quickly as possible. First of all, I would like to congratulate Carlos and his team at the Center of African Studies at our university for the a very interesting piece of paper they put together, addressing some of the key issues that some of us have been also trying to look into, and they have come with an interesting perspective on looking on how organizations in Mozambique, this what they call non-profit organizations, have been sort of contributing to what one could say social inclusion or economic inclusion of the youth in Mozambique. My main takeaway from reading your paper, Carlos and team, is that I would like you guys also to have some ideas in terms of coming up with a very precise conceptualization about what you, in the context of Mozambique, are referring to as a non-profit organizations, because at time you refer them as non-governmental organizations, and then at time you refer them as civil society. From the presentations here, it's possible to see that there's some overlapping sort of areas or aspects or issues, but I don't think that NPOs and NGOs and civil society organizations can just be used to describe sort of the same sort of group of organizational institutions. It would be really nice to have some sort of discussion that's at the beginning, beginning of the paper about what you mean by a non-profit organization in the context of Mozambique, because the data that you refer later on seems to speak about sort of institutions that, let's say, as you described later on, you have associations, foundations, religious groups, and then the initial discussion is all about how important non-profit organizations or non-governmental organizations, mostly based in urban areas, are important for strengthening democracy and so on. So I think it will be important at the beginning of the paper to come up with a very sort of solid discussion about conceptual issues that later on can speak to the data, and that would be linked to the policy recommendation that you might want to make towards the end of the paper. That would be my first point. The second thing has to do with, I think you have done a great job in showing that some of the economic policy that Mozambique has been more or less trying to implement over the past years, related particularly with the extraction of natural resources through large companies or mega projects, as you described them, these really huge projects, capital-intensive projects, have done very little in creating job opportunities for the youth. But on the contrary, you sort of missed out some of the interesting policies that the country implemented and allocating funds to the districts. We had the, if you can remember correctly, the 7 million metikash, that some few $100 that the government will give to each district in Mozambique to address issues of job employment creation and productivity in agriculture and other sectors. And it would be important to evaluate to what extent that program that ran at least to a decade or so had actually contributed to create opportunities or not, and what was the reasons for failure or successful cases of the implementation of that program. And that was implemented every district in Mozambique. And recently, I think the government has been trying to revive that program with what they call the funds for local development, funds for development local in Portuguese. So it'd be nice also to look into that and see if the mistakes from the past will not be repeated. So we'll not have a similar situation where there's money being channeled for purposes of local development, but then something in terms of capture of those funds or something else probably do happen, and the expected results are not achieved. So it'd be important, from my point of view, to look into these two different scenarios, the past and the current ongoing allocation of funds to this region, to see how these at least could contribute to strengthen some of the local organizations, whatever you describe them, more NGOs or non-profit organizations or anything like that, to see if that money being channeled to this organization could have made any different could have contributed to achieve a different result. So I think the paper should address that aspect in terms of literature review. Then I think there's an issue that has to do with the terminology that you're using when you present the data. I think you obtained the data from the National Institute of Statistics, and you have a discussion there about what you call legal entities. By legal entities, you mean only associations or organizations that are legally recognized, registered, or what? So this is also very important to come up in the discussion, so that when you link this discussion with employment opportunities and other things that happen in Mozambique related to youth, at least we are clear about what's the focus of the paper is or should be about. One other aspect I think that is really important to me is this issue of sectors. You have sectors and sub-sectors and all that. This needs to be, at least in the case of Mozambique, be looked at with some sort of not just the historical perspective, but also what's happening in terms of strategies of the government in terms of developing through capital-intensive initiatives that are really largely based on extracting natural resources. So can this extraction of resources, the way that has been done, contribute to the creation of employment opportunities, and to what extent this could really be in relation to the demographic change that we see, more young people, more need for employment, for job creation, all that. And on the other hand, we have these large investments. Mozambique will be probably the top 2 or 3 countries in the coming 2 or 3 years in exporting natural gas, if we are not already in the top 5 in Africa. And there are massive investments happening in that area. So how will that be relevant to promote employment or could transform the economies? Let's say channels that could move the money from these from taxes and other revenues from the extraction of these natural resources into creation of opportunities for young people in the country, because otherwise the demographic dividend, as you discussed in the paper, won't be achieved if we continue business as usual. But at the same time, you have all these debates about energetic transition. So we have to move from fossil-based energies to greener and cleaner energies. And caught in this debate, we have all what's going on in terms of investment, massive investment into that sector. How will that actually, be a part of is this part of the debate or not in terms of creating job and employment opportunities for young people in Mozambique? We also have issues related to changes that are taking place in terms of moving the population in Mozambique being gradually transiting from mostly rural-based population to urban-based population. So we are seeing this transition from a society that's largely rural to become more urbanized. Yet the natural resources are extracted in remote rural areas, but young people are moving from rural areas into urban areas. So this process of capital is going in one direction, population are going into in a different direction. How do we reconcile that? How do we make these flows of capital and population into more consistent flows that can contribute to achieve a better human development, economic development? So unfortunately, because of time constraint, I'll have to stop here, and other comments I might written stuff I have it in written format that I can share with Carlos and the team. And thank you guys for having me.
Thank you so much, Professor Rogers, for your time and for the opportunity to share your time with us. I'll call on the last discussant, Dr. Matilda, to share her insights. Dr. Matilda Kaliba from.
Okay, thank you so much, moderator. And I would like to also thank Dr. Eleanor Chipeta for the report on Zambia, which has provided some compelling contribution in how we understand these two sectors, which for me, I mean, looking at the project concept that was shared with us, I was trying to understand what a difficult task it must have been, to find literature that is going to bring these two somewhat different sectors together. Because you are looking at the nonprofit sector on one hand, you're also looking at the youth and challenges with employment on the other hand, but then not just any other kind of employment, you're looking at dignified and fulfilling work. So which is quite some task, especially if you have to rely mostly on secondary data. But of course, my reflections will focus on the policy implications and of course, maybe research opportunities that I have seen emerging out of the report that was written for Zambia. So the first, I think I would also like to just highlight here that I know the constraints that are associated with secondary review or a literature review. But then I would have hoped that we look at maybe certain databases that would have given us a more accurate picture of the situation in Zambia, because there's quite some interesting picture that youth unemployment poses in Zambia. When you consider even just World Bank data over the period under review, say up to 2023, but if you were to go back to say 1991, I saw the case for Ghana. They had 1991 as a benchmark because of something around civil society at that point. But for us, because that marks multipartism in Zambia, and so with the coming of multipartism, you find that this also led to, the dominance of civil society in Zambia. So, but then when you look at employment trends over these periods, you actually realize that at some point now youth unemployment begins to go down, which is somewhat, of an irony because the report paints, all over Africa, we like to gloss over how, the situation is there and so on. But then when we look at the data is showing us something, a bit of a different picture. So this could also point to some targeted employment policies, supporting youth in these countries. And I'll speak for Zambia. Because when you look at the youth in Zambia, and I think all over Africa now, we are seeing, these young people called Gen Zs around. So there's a political economy aspect there that comes in. So you find that even the kind of policies, the kind of interventions, initiatives around youth, are all about trying to engage them from an economic standpoint. I'll tell you that, for instance, in Zambia now, we have the commonly used vehicle for youth empowerment, which is called the Constituency Development Fund, which has since gained traction since 2021. And since 2021, because it was the youth that led to regime change in 2021. And even when you look back to 1991 to date, you see the youth and civil society together being at each of the country's defining moments on the political scene. So you see that once the youth usher in a government, you find that government somewhat is indebted to seeing to it that, they also fulfill on the part of the youth. And so there've been calls, for youth empowerment under the CDF specific bursaries towards skills development. Of course, we need some empirical data to now review the extent, or rather the impact of these interventions. But the actual interventions or initiatives are actually taking place and being implemented, and we have youths giving their stories of how this, empowerment in terms of skills training has resulted in them being self-employed. But then again, it brings us down to the issue of how we define formal versus informal. I see that somewhat we want to go with the formal. In most cases, when we are looking at employment data, it's always skewed towards formal employment, but then you find that the informal sector in our countries, also contributes largely, to employment, and sometimes dignified. It's just the informal bracket from a political economy perspective that, gives it a bad name, but actually, in terms of dignity, fulfilling, you find we have young people that are making strides within the informal space. So it's also about how we are now going to define this informal sector in the Zambian context, because now the push is towards entrepreneurship. And in most cases, as these young people are starting out with their businesses, they would rather operate in the informal space to avoid all these business bureaucracies that they need in order to formalize. So there's also that issue, that we need to look at. But then the report highlights that youth unemployment is not just a problem of job scarcity, right? But it's, an issue also of a skills mismatch and perhaps low levels of education, which is true. But then this means that even the opportunities that exist for young people, in most cases, many young people are not able to access these, the digital access issues, digital literacy issues. And even when they access them because of lack of skills, then they cannot sustain them. So on the part of the non-profit organizations or the non-profit sector, I see then a need here, for instance, an opportunity in the Zambian context for them to position themselves to address this by perhaps also contributing towards skills training, entrepreneurship, digital inclusion programs, and so on. And then while this can be done, but I think for this to be sustainable, we need to link these to, to have some national framework, so to speak, so that these non-profit organizations are feeding into some national, employment framework, so to speak. But ultimately, again, what we need is data that will show us to say, this is what the non-profit sector is actually providing at the moment. And I think this is something that is lacking, and it's not easy to find online unless you go in empirically to do a mapping, on youth employment in different organizations. From my own experience in the civil society space, I've seen how that most of the key organizations that are doing quite some good work on advocacy in the country are youth-led. You find the CEO of the organization is a person below 35 by our definition of youth. Okay, so, and then there's also this trend where every time they are convening meetings, they'll, when you're doing your meeting registration, there's always a category on your age. So it's divided whether youth or non-youth. So I want to believe that in the Zambian context, it could be easy to actually, see the extent of reach from the non-profit sector, especially, civil society organizations. But then even when we are defining non-profit, we need to also be careful who we are really looking at here, okay, in terms of trade. The bigger definition of civil society includes trade unions. Do we want to consider trade unions as well, or are we just looking at NGOs per se, or any, as long as they are non-profit, companies limited by guarantee and so on? So I think that's another reflection for the project. And even another, just quickly to mention that for the broader project, while we are still on these categorizations, definitions, that it would be important to understand whether the goal of the project is to have a universal definition of these issues, in terms of youth, in terms of non-profit, what it is in Uganda versus what it is in Zambia. Because I think in Uganda, I heard the youth is up to a certain age, much lower than, in the Zambian context of 35. So which would be interesting, or perhaps we are going more with more contextual analysis, focusing on country level definitions. And also just to mention here to say, for instance, the dual program that Doc mentioned is actually a government lead, much as it is supported by the World Bank. So through cooperating partners, but an initiative of the government, through the gender division. And we've also had several other, presidential initiatives. Recently, there's one on specialist training in irrigation, sponsored by the president to Israel and so on. This is because you mentioned also how that there are opportunities within agriculture. But I think ultimately we need to have, to anchor all these interesting issues that are coming out to see how best then this sector can contribute to youth unemployment in Zambia. But in closing, I'll just say that the report is actually a good step in the right direction. The team managed to synthesize whatever is available online on Zambia nonprofit, and to help us rethink nonprofit sector not merely as a welfare, actor, because I think generally in Zambia, if you ask us about the significance of the non-sector or nonprofit sector, it's mostly on how that it's, they help out in welfare issues. But then to now begin to look at their contribution, which definitely is immense, also in terms of employment, particularly towards young people. So sorry, I think I've gone overboard, but thank you so much, Chair and Dr. Chipeta for the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Matilda, for the interesting insight. And we thank all our panelists and our discussants for this great insight, making sure that we understand the state of the literature regarding this particular topic. So I think because of our time, I'll open it up. If there's any question, let me be one from each country, 4 questions, and we can wrap up and close. Dr. Paul.
Very much, Dr. Dennis. My question goes to Dr. Sylvester and anyone that can help. I mean, it was interesting to note that the number of NPOs in Ghana from 2009 to 2021 grew from 4,463 to 10,474. But with this significant growth, what accounts for the low contribution of NPOs to direct employment, contributing less than 1%, just about 0.3%, if I got it right from the data?
Yeah, so we'll take Dr. Sylvester, please note the question, and we'll take another question if there's any. I don't know if the IT team can help if there's any question. Maybe Dr. Sylvester, you can help us answer that question. or any member, any, I'm not sure we have, is Dr. Sylvester online?
Okay, that's fine. Maybe I can engage him after the program.
Okay, but
Okay.
if there's any issue in terms of anybody on the panelists, there are similar situation in your country that probably you want to share some thoughts, you can also feel free and do so. And I see a question from the chat that says, apart from government and non-profit sector, are there measures to see the provision of employment solely from the people? I'm asking particularly about ways in the people can be empowered to provide employment for themselves instead of blaming and looking up to the government, which are uninterested in rising the occasion. So, I mean, there's a question that apart from the government and non-profit sector, are there measures to see the provision of employment solely from the people? I don't know if there anybody from the panelists would want to reflect on that.
Yeah, Dr. Dennis.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think however you look at it, I mean, the government will come in because you talk to some of these young graduates, they are poised to set up. But the question is the macroeconomic environment conducive for even starting up where interest rates are high. So for the youth from deprived areas who probably might have struggled through their training or education, they come out and they do not have anything in terms of savings to start up. And so they go to the financial system for funding support in terms of startup. But here is the case, banks are not looking their way. And even if they give them loans, the rates are such that you cannot simply manage around it. In most African countries, interest rates are, inflation rates are high, macroeconomic instability. And so planning as a startup even is a challenge. And even when you have produced, sometimes market also becomes a problem. In Ghana now, rice farmers are crying because what they harvested last year has not been bought because the cedi appreciation has led to a situation where imported rice has become relatively cheaper. So people are not buying the local rice even after they have produced. And it's not their fault. Some of them have taken loans. So what do? So it is important that government comes in to make sure that we even create a demand, buy to feed senior high schools under the free SHS program. But government is not looking their way. Government is not listening in that regard. And so I think government has to come in. Government has to create the environment, make sure it facilitate the demand to encourage these people that want to go into entrepreneurship. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Appiah. Because of time, we'll end here. There's a lot of interesting insights from other countries, which we'll also be sharing in our subsequent webinar. So if you go on our website, capsi.co.za, you could see the report under publication session. You could see all the reports, most of them are there. You can have and look at it and read it. And then, there are a lot of research opportunities in there for our students, for practitioners who want knowledge in this particular field. Yeah, so thank you so much. I'll hand over to CAPSI Director, Professor Becky Moyo, to close us in terms of our closing remarks. Prof, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dennis, for facilitating such a powerful, insightful conversation. And thank you to the speakers, Ronald, Carlos, Eleno, and Sylvester. But also thank you to the discussants, also from the countries where the studies were based on. I can't mention everyone all, but at least I know that we had powerful inputs from Paul, from Moses, and other colleagues that came from Mozambique and Zambia. So thank you so much, everyone. I think the team is going to be announcing the next webinar and the countries that will be covered. I saw somebody online was asking, when is Nigeria next? Definitely we will have Nigeria presented. All the countries that I mentioned in the beginning are going to be covered in the next webinar. So we have 3 more webinars that are going to take place. and hopefully we can cover most of those countries in the next coming months. I mean, I think the part that I would love us to try and do in the next webinar is to see the extent to which we can also incorporate some findings from the field, because largely today the discussion was based more on literature reviews, but in most of these countries, we already have some preliminary findings from the field. And so for countries where the literature review is conducted by the same partner that is doing the quantitative study, it might be useful to begin integrating the quantitative preliminary findings, even though we'll come back to it later. But I think it might be useful because it does cover some of the gaps that were explored beyond the literature review. So thank you, everyone, and wish you the best, and we see you next in the upcoming webinar. So thank you, Dennis, and thanks the team at CAPSI for putting this together. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. And thanks to everyone who joined this session. Looking forward to seeing you again on our webinar. Thank you. Bye.
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 Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thanks, Roger.